Welcome to episode number 21 of Oil Painting Question and Answers. Before I get into the questions, I want to do a little lesson on the creative mode of thinking and the critical mode of thinking, and it's very distinct. And there's a lot of different words for it, but the word I use is critical mode versus creative mode. And so let me explain what I'm talking about. Oh, and by the way, I wanted to tell everybody how much I really appreciate all the fantastic reviews we've been getting on our paint, and just can't thank you enough. I'm just overwhelmed by the positive reviews, and really want to thank everybody who contributed a review, and I really appreciate it, and it just really means so much to me after all the effort and work we put into the paint and everything to get such positive feedback. It really means a lot. So I wanted to mention that. But let's get into this idea about critical mode versus creative mode. Okay, so let's say you're starting off and you decide you want to paint a still life or landscape or portrait, whatever it is. And what happens is that when you first get this idea and you fall in love with a portrait or a photograph or even a vista that you're looking at, you're 100% in the creative mode. In other words, you're reacting to the landscape or the portrait, and it touches you in some way, and or even you have an idea in your head that you really like, and you think to yourself, it'll make a great painting. And at that moment, that idea is as strong as it's ever going to be. And this is, really gets into the artist's curse. But what I mean is, let's say that let's just take a still life as an example, but it could be a portrait or a landscape or anything. And let's say you set up a still life, and you're sitting there and you're playing with it, and this is very much the creative mode. You're looking at it, you're deciding, do I like that, do I not like that? You're not thinking about measurements, you're not thinking about, hopefully not about rules of composition, but you're really just reacting to what you're looking at. And that is very much the creative mode. Okay, now once you decide, and I even tell people that when you're in that creative mode, and I've heard this from other people, but it's really it's almost more of a childish way of thinking. It's like play. You're enjoying yourself. You're looking at something. You're deciding whether you like it or not. You really should be very opinionated at that point. And but once you have this concept, and once you decide on something, and let's say it's a still life, and you say, okay, I like that, I love it, I want to paint it. And from that moment, the idea begins to die. And it's no different than, let's say that if I was, I used to have a screensaver, or rather a desktop on my computer, and it was a George Inness painting that I absolutely loved. And it was one of those paintings that, and I was very much in the creative mode, and I was, saw this painting online, I believe, and I just was really touched by this painting. But the moment I put it on my desktop, and I loved it, and then a year later it was still there, and I looked at the painting and I realized it really didn't touch me the same way. I still loved it, I still appreciated it, I still thought it was a great piece of art, but it didn't have quite the impact that it did a year ago before I put it on my desktop and before I looked at it, for a year every single day. And so that's what happens to you, when you decide you love something and you think, boy, this will be great. The moment you start to turn that into a painting, your brain changes into the critical mode. You start having to think about canvas size, about placement and proportion and mixing colors and getting your colors right and getting your shadow right. And it's all critical. It can be creative at that point. There can be some brush work that's creative and all kinds of things. But your basic sense about whether the painting is succeeding or not, or whether it's great art or not, you lose that. You lose that objectivity the more you work on it. And over time, you really can lose it to the point where you just almost even don't enjoy the painting anymore, because you've taken it from this very creative mindset where you fell in love with this composition and you really thought it was something, and then after working on it for several weeks and breaking it down and turning it into paint on a canvas, your brain, through that critical process, the art loses some of its spark. It's the artist is the magician, so to speak, and you know how the magic trick was performed, and so therefore it loses some of its edge. So it's just something to be aware of, and not to let it get into your work. Because I've seen a lot of artists, it's a really big deal. And they get started on a painting, and then by the time they get 3/4 in, they lose interest in their work, and it even affects the quality of or their the way they paint it. They don't paint it as well because they're not as excited about it anymore. So just be aware that once you decide on a concept, whether it's a still life or whether it's a landscape or portrait or whatever it is, if you see something and you love it, then that's it. You've got to trust that, because that is the most true. That is the time when you have the truest instinct for it. So anyway, I hope that's helpful. It really is a big deal, and a lot of artists get discouraged because of that. So just if you're aware of it, it can be really helpful. At least it was for me. So without further ado, let's get into some questions. What kind of paint do you suggest for a beginner? Oil, watercolor, acrylic, or gouache, etc.? I'm glad you asked that question. I think that a lot of times, people, for instance, use acrylic paint because they think it's a lot more convenient or a lot easier to deal with than oil paint, and a lot of that comes from the history of oil paint. And it, in the very beginning, was extremely complicated. You had to literally make your own paint by mixing powder and oil, and then over the years and the decades, it has become easier and easier. But if you're working in multiple layers and you're building up layers like a lot of methods describe, then in that case it can get pretty complicated, because you got to worry about fat over lean, and you have to worry about which involves a lot of medium control and knowing what you're doing. But on the other hand, if you paint wet and wet like I do, I personally find it by far the easiest way to paint. If I tried to paint a face with acrylic paint, I simply couldn't do it. It would be drying so fast. I couldn't get the color blends that I wanted to. It just drive me crazy. The other thing is, people think acrylic paint is, or watercolor for that matter, is easy because you have water cleanup and you don't have to deal with all the solvents and the oils and all that. But if you're painting wet and wet, it can be very simple. If you're using the Geneva Artist Oil Color, then it's ready to use. It's oil paint, but it already has the medium mixed into it. It doesn't have solvents, so there's no fumes that you have to deal with. The thing about the Geneva Artist Oil Color is it's really designed for wet and wet. So if you're building it up in layers and everything, it's really not designed for that. But if you're working wet and wet, which is the way that I teach and the only way that I paint, I find that it's by far the most simplest and easiest approach to painting. You stain your canvas, you mix up your colors, and you paint it on the canvas. Simple as that. The paint dries extremely slow, so it has a lot of open time, so to speak. That's something you don't get with acrylic. That means you can blend, if you have a dark shadow, you can blend a wet mid-tone into it, and you get a wonderful transition. If you're working wet on dry, you simply can't get the same sort of blend, either for color or even for just the natural way that wet paint blends into wet paint. It's a completely different thing than taking wet paint and sort of rubbing it on top of dry paint. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just the wet and wet method that I teach is essentially very, very simple. So I would highly recommend you, taking a look at painting in oil color, wet and wet, and just considering that, because it really is the most direct, simple way that I know of to paint. White sucks the life out of color, all right. It's kind of a gray. I'm getting the hang of it now, but struggling with intermediate values. Any general tip for making intermediate values without white? I think that it's important to understand that there are definitely times when you need to use white. If you need to use white, then you have to use white. There's most colors actually have white in them. Even most intermediate colors have some white in them. If you're mixing something very orange, like a orange fruit or brass, vase or whatever, then a lot of those colors are going to be deep bronzes that are made without white because they're burn umber and yellow and some red. But even as you come out of the brass color and get into the intermediates or even closer to the highlights, you'll find that you have to use white to put some milkiness into it. And if you don't do it, then the color's not going to look right. So it's not really a question of how can I mix this color without white. If you go through the color mixing process, and I have a video that explains it. I've got several videos, but one in particular on how to match one color to another. And you just go through that workflow, and if you get to the point in the color where you're looking at something and your color looks more orange, and let's say it's a deep shadow color, or an intermediate for that matter, and if your color looks too orange compared to your source, you have no choice. You've got to put white in it, because the only other way to lighten it up would be to put yellow, which is just going to keep it all the way over on the orangey yellow side. And when you're holding it out and noticing that the brass is less orange, you have no choice but to look at the color wheel and see that white's over there on the opposite side of the orange, so you add a little white to it to lighten it up instead of yellow, and lo and behold, it's going to be less orangey, and you're going to get a better color match. So the point is that if you need to use white, you have to use white. You shouldn't be afraid of it, but just be aware that if you do mix colors with white, especially the highlights, and you just go blend down into your shadow, it only takes 2 brush strokes to milk up that whole shadow. So you really have to be careful to protect your shadows from that milk. And anyway, so I hope that answers your question. The Geneva paint sounds amazing, but a question: if the paint is already mixed to a specific consistency, how do I go about making it more transparent, thinner, or on the contrary, thicker, like if I wanted to do an impasto style like Van Gogh? Well, that's just it. The Geneva Artist Oil Color is designed to be the paint that I love using my method. So I never ever paint impasto. So the paint is really not designed for people that like to paint impasto. There's all kinds of thickening mediums out there, and you can use any of those. It's Geneva Artist Color is just it's oil paint, just like any other oil paint, and so you can use any medium you want with it. But the thing is that the Geneva paint really was designed to squirt out of the tube and be ready to use. It has all the flow. It's made for a wet and wet style, but not for doing impasto or for doing transparent glazing or anything else. But if you can certainly, as I said before, even to create a transparent color, there's mediums that you could add to it to do that. But I haven't tested them, so I can't recommend anything specifically. What palette would you recommend for painting from a black and white photograph? If I use ivory black and titanium white, the whole picture has a purple tone to it that I don't like. Well, in general, what's happening here is, you can certainly add some burn umber to your black to warm it up and make it'll kill the purple, so to speak, to some degree. But in general, anytime, when you paint, it's a mistake to take a shadow color and then a highlight color and sort of blend those 2 colors to create an intermediate color. Because a lot of those colors, like for instance in your case, it turns out to be purple. You look at the highlight, you don't see purple. You look into the ivory black, you don't see purple, but you mix them together and you get purple. And so the thing there is that, the way that I teach to paint and the way that painting has been taught for eons is to, lay your colors in without blending them, to put them in and let them stand alone. So therefore, what you would do if I was going to paint in black and white is I would have my black colors, and then I would literally mix the dark intermediates, the intermediates, the lighter intermediates, and then even the highlights. I would have those mixed independently. So therefore, which is the way you always paint, even when you're painting full color. And therefore, when you mix those intermediate shades, if you have one that's too purple, then you add a little yellow to it. You just look at your color wheel, use the color mixing rules, and I've got a video about how to match one color to another. But you just look at the color wheel, and if it's too purple, you add a little yellow. So you would add a little bit of yellow to each one of those intermediates and then treat them all independently. Paint in your dark, then clean your brush a little bit, wipe it off, pick up some intermediate color which might have a little more yellow into it, and so you just kill the purple that way by getting yellow into those intermediate colors. And it won't need much. I'm not saying to make those colors yellow. I'm just saying that if you add just a touch of yellow to those purpley intermediates, it's going to get rid of the purple very quickly. Got the impression from watching the episode on cleaning brushes that your brush dip doesn't work well with synthetic brushes. Is it so? No, it works fantastic with synthetic brushes. In fact, the thing is synthetic brushes can take a lot more abuse than natural brushes. And so, for instance, you can clean a synthetic brush. I'm not positive about this, but as far as I know, you can clean a synthetic brush with soap and water, and it won't hurt the bristles at all. But if you're using a natural hog's hair, there's a lot of soaps out there that will absolutely ruin a brush in a single cleaning. So therefore, but the brush dip, it's going to work, and it doesn't have any harmful effects. It's just safflower oil with clove leaf oil in it, and it's 98% artist grade safflower oil, which is wonderful for your bristles. It almost conditions the brushes. So it certainly will work on synthetic brushes because it works great on the hog's hair brushes, natural brushes. If you go to drawmixpaint.com, you can find links to all my free videos. If you go to genevafineart.com, you can find out all about the paint that I use to paint with, that I manufacture myself right here in Austin, Texas. And thank you so much for watching.